This video is about sampling methods, so let's take a look at all the vocab and stuff we need to talk about that. So our population always consists of a lot of individuals. Individuals are often people, but they could be animals, iPhones, or really any collection of things. And it usually has the word all in the front, like all freshmen at PSU or all pop songs recorded by female artists in 2012. If you have a collection of all the things, that could form a population. Now, populations usually vary on some attributes. Attributes or variables could be things like size, age, people have different beliefs, a lot of things have different origins, genres, etc. So however things vary, those would be called attributes or variables. Now, the population is large, so instead of collecting data on the entire population, it's usually more feasible, both in terms of time and money, to collect data on some of these individuals. That is what's known as a sample. So a population is all of the things. A sample would be some of the things. A sampling method is a way to pick a sample. You could just pick them based on all your best friends or the ones that are closest to you, but you'd like to have a method that avoids bias, which is anything in the method that makes your sample not reflect your population. The best way to avoid bias is to employ randomization. There are a few methods that use randomization. These are the four we're going to talk about in this video, including a simple random sample, a stratified random sample, a cluster sample, and a systematic sample. For purposes of this video, we're going to use a population of little boxes that I made in Excel. So each one of these little boxes is an individual in our population. And you can see they differ on three attributes. One is the symbol. These are all Greek letters. There's 5 different capital Greek letters here. The second is the background color of the box. And the third is the font style. Some are bold, some are italic, and some are underlined. And our population is quite large. It extends this way for quite a while. So instead of looking at every member of this population, we'll look at ways to take a sample of some of these. And we'd like our sample to reflect essentially the same distribution of letter, color, and font style that we get here. For a simple random sample, I need a list of all the individuals in my population. So I put that over here. Here was the first column. I just did a little screenshot there. So here is numbers 1 through 20 in that first column, and I just broke it out into their attributes. The letter is an omega, the style is an underline, the color is yellow. The second one, also an omega, also an underline, but this one is blue. The third one's a sigma, italic, and yellow, and so on. So the population consists of 3,000 total individuals. We'd like a sample size, and this is usually up to the researcher, but let's say this is Math 243. So we'd like a sample size of 243 individuals, which means for a simple random sample, which is also abbreviated SRS fairly often, that got cut off, that's okay. We select 243 individuals completely at random. This is just like drawing names from a hat. So we just put the numbers 1 through 243 here, and then we select them. Now, I can't actually put these all in a hat in Excel, but what I could do is just say rand between. That'll let me randomly draw a person or an individual between 1 and 3,000. So whenever it comes up, 2507. So what I would do here is I'd go to my list, scroll all the way down to individual 2507, and they would be in my sample. And I could do the same thing here, rand between 1, 3,000. Well, that one changes because that's how Excel works. But individual 378, I would scroll over here to 378 and put them in my sample. So simple random sample is simple. It's about the simplest thing you can do is just pick individuals completely at random, but you do kind of need to have a list of them numbered or written their names down or something to start with. In a stratified random sample, what we do is we separate the population into groups based on a shared characteristic, one of those attributes or variables that we looked at before. Then we do an SRS, a simple random sample, within each of those groups so that the sample matches the population. As an example, let's do a stratified random sample and let's stratify by letter. That was one of our attributes. So we need to know the population overview for this. And here I've calculated that in the population, this is size. Size were 238 out of 3,000 of the total population, which works out to 7.9%. Sigmas were 21.5%, and so on. So if we want a sample of 243 people, we want basically to match these same percentages in our sample. So what you do to figure out how many of each you need is, for this, for instance, you take your sample size, 243, and I multiplied it by my population percent of 7.9%. So what this means is my sample should contain 19.278 size. Of course, that's not really possible because we have to have whole numbers. So what we do is we just round these. So we go down here. Our sample should contain 19 size. So now we do a simple random sample of 19 size. I'm not sure how to punctuate that, but that seems right. And here we do a simple random sample of 52 sigmas, and so on. And that would give us a total of 243 in our sample. Then we'd have the same ratios of the letters in the sample as we do in the population, which is really important in things like voting if you think that these are all distinct categories, like age groups, genders, ethnicities, voting preferences, things like that. You want to make sure that your sample matches the population on important attributes. In a cluster sample, we're also going to separate the population into groups, but each group we want to contain diversity. We do not want them to be homogeneous. In our stratified sample, we wanted all the groups to be all reds or all sigmas or something like that. But here, I've separated our population of 3,000 individuals into groups of 25 based on just taking squares. So this is one cluster, cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, cluster 4, and so on. And each of these is diverse. They have a mix of letters, styles, and background colors for a total of 120 clusters. So if we want a sample size of 243 individuals, that means we should select 10 clusters at random. Each cluster is 25 individuals. 10 times 25 would be 250. Going a little bit bigger than this is always better. Larger samples are good. You reduce your sampling variability. So we need 10 clusters. Which ones should we pick? So we just pick them at random. There are 120 different clusters, so we just do ram between 1, 120. And it says we should select cluster 87. So we go up here, we count up whichever one number 87 is. All 25 of those individuals would be in our sample. And same thing here. Let's copy paste that. That was 87. The next one was 24. So then we select cluster 24 and put those individuals in our sample as well. And after we do that, we'll have 250 total individuals made up of clusters that are, in this case, the clusters were just in squares next to each other. In real situations, clusters could be based on geography, like, neighborhoods that are close to each other, or if you were talking about people, you could talk about like the streets people live on or neighborhoods or something like that. But the point is each group should be diverse, not homogeneous. A systematic sample is when we select every 5th individual to be in the sample, or it could be every 10th, every 50th, something like that. And the randomness in this location comes from we start at a random location within the first block. So let's suppose we want to do a systematic sample of 243 individuals. Our population size is 3,000. We'd like a sample size of 243. So what we do is we divide these two. 3,000 divided by 243 means that we need to sample every 12.34568th person. That's not really realistic, so we're going to round that down to 12. And rounding it down in this case will make sure our sample is larger than 243. And that's our minimum. If we get more than that, it's fine. So we're going to randomly start with an individual somewhere in the first 12 people. So we do ran between 1, 12. So we're going to start at person 10. And then the next person would be 12 more than that. So the next person will be person 22. After that, individual 34. After that, individual 46. And we just keep doing this all the way up. We'll end up somewhere around 3,000 with our required sample size. So this is very regular. Without the random start, though, you wouldn't have much of a sampling method. At least it wouldn't be as good because you wouldn't be assured that every single member of the population had a chance to be included. There are a couple other methods that we can also talk about just to be inclusive of them all. A convenience sample selects individuals based on ease of inclusion. So the people in your class are much easier to survey, for instance, than a random sample of PCC students. Cars in your neighborhood would be easier than randomly selecting neighborhoods or cars from all over town or the city or whatever. Everyone in your email list is much easier to email than random people from all over the world. It's generally biased because not every member of the population has the same chance to be included. But the biggest problem is you don't really know if the people in your class would be representative of all college students or all PCC students or whatever. Similarly, your neighborhood could be different than another neighborhood. Maybe you live somewhere really rich and everyone drives a Tesla and a Mercedes or something. A voluntary response sample requires individuals to do some extra work to include themselves. So you're not doing the asking of the questions, you're telling people they have to do something to include themselves. So if you see an ad online that says click here to take a survey, only people who want to take a survey at that exact moment are going to do it. Same thing with online reviews. A lot of product reviews are voluntary response. Now, generally these are considered biased because people with strong opinions will respond more than people who are about it. You know, Yelp reviews or something for restaurants, you know, if you had a fine time and it was normal and you don't have any particular thoughts, you're probably not going to go review it. But if you loved it or hated it, you're much more likely to do it. A multi-stage sample uses a combination of methods. For example, what percent of the US population has COVID-19? How would you answer this question? The US is a very large country with people spread out all over. So suppose we have 100,000 tests available to answer this question. So the first thing you might do is split the tests by state in proportion to their population. So you would stratify based on the population of the state. I just looked up the numbers. California has 11.9% of the population of the country, so they would get 11.9% of the test, which would be 11,900. Then you could divide each state into small areas of 500 residents, so in essentially making clusters. And then you could randomly select those small areas, the clusters, and test everyone in them. And that way you might be able to get an approximation of this question. You're not going to include everyone, but you'd get pretty close to a good answer. To conclude, just a couple final notes. For instance, don't mix up the terminology. If you see SRS, that means simple random sample. Now, it gets weird because stratified and systematic also start with an S, but those are not SRS. SRS only applies to simple random sample, so you'd have to write out the words stratified and systematic instead. The second thing is stratified and cluster both use groups, but in a stratified sample, everyone in the group is the same in some way. So they're the same or similar ages, they have the same background colors, they were built in the same factory, something like that. In a cluster sample, that's not true. You want the groups each to be different than each other, not the same in one attribute. That could happen randomly, but you didn't decide that from the beginning. Voluntary response has a special meaning in statistics. This is true in a lot of statistics words, that there's a special word or phrase that's different from how it sounds like it should mean in English. It does not mean that response is voluntary. It sounds like it should be. But if you're dealing with people, if you're doing a survey or something, they can always choose not to participate. It's always voluntary in the English sense. Voluntary response, however, means that people opt themselves into the sample group. You don't ask them to be in it, at least not directly. And lastly, methods that use randomness are unbiased, but that doesn't mean they're accurate. That's how randomness works. Sometimes you do get weird results. I could try to do a sample of 500 people who live in my neighborhood, but I might randomly just end up getting 500 people who are angry with me and give me false or misleading answers. It's not very likely, but it could happen. Similarly, if you use a small sample, you're just going to have a lot of variability. If I try to sample 4 people and make a statement about the entire US population, it's just probably not going to work. Those 4 people might all be the exact same as me. They might all be completely different. They might all be completely different from each other. And that's all I have to say about sampling methods.